Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Webster Tarpley. It's been called the biggest strike in 30 years, in which 2 million people came out to strike in what has been deemed a triple assault on their pension. But is this strike only about pensions? In this edition of the News Analysis, we will discuss the impact of these pension cuts, which are part of the larger austerity cuts exercised by the government, the biggest package of austerity cuts since World War II, and whether the British society will tolerate what has been described as the government's attack on their livelihoods.
Public sector workers around the UK have staged a mass strike in confrontation with the government over its austerity measures. With millions joining marches across the nation, unions say it's the biggest walkout in decades. Thousands of schools are closed and hospital operations have been cancelled. Dozens have been arrested following sporadic clashes between police and protesters.
The British government is so concerned in focusing on the state of society across the world and accusing other countries of not looking after their own people, or of human rights abuses, or of needing to improve the standard of living for their own people. Here at home, while in the same breath, they are attacking their very own people.
Unions oppose government plans that make workers pay more and work longer to earn their pensions. They accuse the government of turning a blind eye on tax evasions by big companies, while further burdening the working class.
Debts need to be dealt with, but I think it's perhaps the people who cause the deficit who ought to be paying for it. And what it seems to be is that the bankers and the financiers and the chief executives of big companies are getting away scot-free, and they've still got their large bonuses, and the poorer people at the other end of the scale on low incomes are the ones that are being made to pay for this deficit.
It's anger because it's so much, and it's for us, not them, as well. Because I don't see the MPs actually putting their hands in their pockets and saying that we're happy to give up our pensions.
Civil servants' anger has also been fueled by new curbs on public sector pay and hundreds of thousands of additional job cuts. The government says unions should try to resolve the pension dispute through dialogue, but union leaders accuse the government of failing to participate in proper negotiations. The tough austerity measures are aimed at tackling Britain's high borrowing levels. The Conservative-led coalition government has cut economic growth forecasts and plans to continue tough spending by 2017. Inflation stands at 5% in the UK, far exceeding pay rises for public and private sector workers.
If you look at the profit figures of companies in Britain, if you look at the money which is in the banks in Britain, it's a substantial amount of money. What I believe should happen is that money should be used to invest in the real things, in the social welfare of the people, in the rebuilding of the country's infrastructure, not spent on things like aircraft carriers to go around the world threatening other people.
People who are on strike today.
Prime Minister David Cameron has played down the impact of the strike action, calling it a damp squib. However, unions say the nationwide walkout is just the start of a wave of protests if the dispute is not resolved.
Let me introduce our guest. Lots to talk about here. Author and lecturer Webster Tarpley joins us from Washington. We also have American broadcaster Carol Gould, who joins us from London. Thank you both. Let me first go to you, Carol Gould. Over 2 million people taking direct action against the government's austerity agenda, the biggest strike in 30 years. How would you evaluate this strike?
It isn't the first demonstration this year. We had a demonstration on March 26th of many different groups of people, the NHS, students, and then there were very violent riots in London in August, which nobody has yet quite been able to explain. It did begin with the shooting of a young black man and shooting by the police. And that accelerated, it became big, it jumped into a giant conflagration with buildings being burnt down. It accelerated at rapid speed. This is quite different today. This is a strike that has been organized for many, many weeks by various trade unions representing what are called public service workers. And I think the reason why there's been quite a big turnout is because there is a general feeling, as you just showed on your clips, of people in Britain, that there are terrible inequalities here, that we have banks and bankers still accumulating money, not distributing money to their savers. Let's not forget savers in this country and in other countries as well, that for several years now, savers have had nothing because the interest rate is almost zero. But the banks are still giving out huge bonuses to their employees and to their executives. And there is a general feeling in this country of terrible inequality. And there is another aspect to this. Sorry, this government keeps talking about all the unemployed people and sick people have got back to work. They've got to get back to work. Well, at the same token, every day we're hearing about chains of shops closing, businesses closing, people being made redundant. I mean, the number of public service workers that they were talking about today who will lose their jobs in the next year or two is close to 500,000. Not all of those people will go on the dole, but that's a lot of people on the welfare rolls. Sir Philip Green, who runs Topshop, the Arcadia Group, he's one of the most successful businessmen in this country, went on TV, and he very rarely gives interviews. He went on TV last week and said he may have to close 260 shops across this country. That's about 2,000 people losing their jobs. So there is a general feeling in this country, even among middle-class people, even among not necessarily liberal or left-voting people, that there is some inequality here, and that this government is trying to crack down on the general working, not just the working class, but all of the workers of the country.
Well, let's look at what the reaction has been of David Cameron there, Webster Tarpley, who has branded the public sector strikes a damp squib. It's not going to change anything. We are being tested, he said, and we'll make it through. How would you evaluate this reaction? Surely, of course, the government has to respond to what has been deemed as the biggest strike in 3 decades.
Well, you're dealing with a very reactionary Tory government. These people are not conservative in any way. They're right-wing radicals, and they have bet their entire political existence, including the Liberal Party, amazingly, who are part of this, on a savage, brutal austerity program. And the irony of these austerity programs, as we see again and again, is that they do not work. They do not work in their own terms. We've seen them in Greece. We've seen them in many countries. In California with Schwarzenegger. We've seen them in Germany with Brüning in 1930 to 1932. Austerity does not work because when you're in a depression, your budget cuts this year will guarantee that you'll have a bigger budget deficit in the following years. But of course, since these are reactionary Tories, they're interested in their long-term ideological commitments. They want to destroy what remains of the British social welfare state and social welfare network. But now they've had to admit that they're looking at a depression. And of course, the background reality of all of this is that we are in a world economic depression. This is a breakdown crisis. This is not simply a matter of income inequality or adjustments that we would like to make in the name of equity or fairness. This is a breakdown crisis. It's a collapse of the entire society. Will human civilization survive in the British Isles under these circumstances? And therefore, the question becomes, as we've seen again and again, it's wonderful that these unions have come out. I hear that there are some unions that have come out today that have never gone on strike, which is an astounding thing, but yes, there it is.
That's right.
So it's good that they've awakened from their slumbers after all these decades. But what are they demanding? As I understand it, it's mainly demands saying we should not be cut. And of course they should not be cut. But to make that stick, you've got to explain how. Who should pay? There's a depression. Cameron and Osborne and the rest of these people say, oh, the working people, the British working people should pay the costs of this depression and the bank bailouts and the derivatives bubbles and Northern Rock and all the rest. So if you don't want that, you've got to have some alternative means. One obvious thing, the City of London is one of the greatest, maybe the greatest setter of speculative financial flows in the world. Take 1% out of that turnover, not their profits, but their turnover, their buying and selling, and use that 1%, put that right into the British Treasury, not for the seals, not for the polar bears, not for the pelicans, but for British working people, not for global warming either, but for right now, to save human beings in the British Isles and maintain your social safety net and maintain your pension system, which is, of course, not generous. It's anything but but generous. Beyond that, you've got to find credit to relaunch an economy.
Right.
They have the Bank of England. Well, nationalize it.
Right. Well, I'd like to
nationalize.
I'd like to take one of the things you said there, Webster Tarpley, and that's about the social services that basically this government is, in the long term, in a sense, wants to do away with it. And Chris Banbury, who joins us right now, he's a political commentator in London. If you can tell us, in terms of these pension cuts, which is part of the larger austerity cuts, which is said would affect the poor the hardest, and of course, with the poor comes the social service aspect of it, of them being the largest recipient of it. What are the dangers there, especially in economically challenged neighborhoods?
Well, we've already seen this summer the biggest social unrest that Britain has seen in over 3 decades, and that's before the cuts really implement. And the sort of community where I live, you're seeing really a succession of blows. People are having to pay more for housing as a result in cuts in housing benefit, which eventually help the poorer people pay the rent. They're seeing their pensions being eroded. This government says that public sector workers should accept what's happened in the private sector, where really pensions have been more or less demolished by employers. The logic to this seems to me that if they introduce slavery in the private sector, the public sector should just accept that as well. But we're seeing other attacks where I am. We're seeing the privatisation of key services in the health service, which Cameron pledged to protect. In childcare, you're seeing private schools being set up. There's a whole agenda here, and it goes by the name that David Cameron gave it of the big society. Big society, small state. And your last speaker was correct. It's an extension of that Thatcherite privatisation strategy of the 1980s, which was a disaster for Britain. As anyone who's sampled British services, British transport,